Ecclesiastes series and to learn together with you. This week I've chosen to look at the tensions in Ecclesiastes around the issue of pleasure. So you might remember last time I read a couple of passages that showed that on the one hand, the teacher, the speaker of the book, seems to sometimes dismiss pleasure or say that there's no profit in it. Other times it seems to be kind of the main good that he finds in life, and so we'll look at that issue from both sides. First, just a little review from last time, and then we'll take a look at some of these pleasure passages that express this tension between the problem of pleasure but also its potential. Last week I gave you an optional homework assignment to look at the book, to take a look at the book. I just wanted to start out and ask if anybody had any questions or comments or things they wanted to address before we get started on the topic for today. If you didn't do your homework, I have a lot of experience with that, so I'm not offended. Just wanted to give you a chance, or any leftover kind of thoughts or questions from last time, to put out there before I talk on and on. All right, well, feel free to speak up at any point. And also, if you do have any questions from your own reading or looking at this, or from what I've said, you're always free to email me too with my email address there. All right, so just a couple. There's a handout out there. You can see that. I just wanted to review a couple of the concepts that we talked about from last time, in case anybody wasn't here for that, or just to refresh your memory. The first one is the identity of this main speaker of the book, Kohelet in Hebrew, usually translated the teacher or the preacher. So Kohelet, you might remember, is from the verb that means, it's related to the verb that means to assemble. So this is probably either a person who assembles people or assembles wisdom, or it's somebody who has some kind of function in an assembly, like a teacher or a preacher. And I think the teacher is a pretty good translation of that. We're clearly meant to think of Solomon when we read these passages. We'll definitely see that when we take a look at the first passage from today in chapter 1 and chapter 2 as the strongest reminiscences of Solomon. But I talked about last week how the language of this book especially, but also some ideas and themes, seems to point to a later time in Israel's history. So after the exile and the return from exile in the Persian period, or some people even date it in the Hellenistic period. It seems to be from that time, and so this Kohelet figure is more of a Solomon-like persona, so putting on a kind of guise of Solomon, and it is notable that we don't see the name Solomon anywhere in the book, as opposed to a book like Proverbs or Song of Songs, where we do have Solomon explicitly invoked. So this seems to be a Solomon-like persona who's speaking to some post-exilic community in Judea, and in a sense, even though it's not really explicit in the book, perhaps looking back at the whole troubled history of Israel that has led up to this point, and in addition to kind of the difficulties that people face under foreign rule in the post-exilic period. So that's the main speaker. There's also a frame on the outside in a different voice in chapter 1:1, and then at the end of the book, at the end of chapter 12, that has a different voice of this kind of author or editor framing Kohelet's words. But we're focusing on the words of Kohelet today. And then we talked about the concept of hevel, which is this word that occurs 38 times in the book. That's really important to the book, and usually translated vanity or meaningless or sometimes futility. And I talked about how it literally means breath or vapor, but usually in the Bible it has some kind of metaphorical connotation, and some of the possibilities, these are not all active in every use of the word, but some of the possibilities are here on your handout: fleeting, insubstantial, empty, worthless, incomprehensible, senseless, absurd. So all of those things are sometimes things that hevel seems to mean, and people disagree about, in the book of Ecclesiastes, what the primary connotation of hevel is. Does it always have the same is it always best translated as fleeting or transient, or maybe absurd, or maybe worthless, or does it take on different meanings in different contexts in the book? And so, as I advise you to do when you read the book, I replaced on the translations meaningless or vanity. I think it's based on the NRSV, so it was vanity. I replaced that with hevel, so you can decide for yourself as we read what you think is the best connotation in that case. All right, so as I said, we're going to take a look at the problem of pleasure, and this part of I chose to look at this partly because it's such a big issue in the book, and partly because it just comes next after the section that we looked at last time. We looked at that opening poem in Ecclesiastes 1 about the futility of human toil and how it used nature as an analogy with the sun, panting around in circles and the rivers always flowing and not really filling up the sea, and how that's an analogy to human life where we're busy and busy and busy, and yet it seems like there's no profit or ultimate gain in our toil. So then it goes on to this passage, Ecclesiastes 1:12 to 2:11 that I have on the handout. And I'm going to read this for you, and I want you to just read along, and if you would, underline or circle things that are standing out to you or that you have questions about. There's some pens here, if maybe Jack, I don't know if you could pass those around if you don't have a pen. And just jot down some notes, because I do want to hear what stands out to you, what do you see as, what comments do you have, what does this make you think of, what questions do you have, as we look at this passage. So I'll read it through. You can make notes. I'll give you another minute or so after I read to look it over, and then we'll talk about this together. I do think, as I said last time, that wisdom literature is often best explored in community and learning from each other. So I want to hear your voices here after we read this passage. All right. I, the teacher, when king over Israel and Jerusalem, applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. It is an unhappy business that God has given to human beings to be busy with. I saw all the deeds that are done under the sun, and see, all is hevel and a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be made straight, and what is lacking cannot be counted. I said to my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a chasing after wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and those who increase knowledge increase sorrow. I said to my heart, come now, I will make a test of pleasure, enjoy yourself. But again, this also was heaven. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? I searched with my heart how to cheer my body with wine, my heart still guiding me with wisdom, and how to lay hold on folly, until I might see what was good for mortals to do under heaven during the few days of their life. I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks and planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had slaves who were born in my house. I also had great possessions of herds and flocks, more than any who had been before me in Jerusalem. I also gathered for myself silver and gold and the treasure of kings and the provinces. I got singers, both men and women, along with humanity's treasure, coffers and coffers of them. So I became great and surpassed all who were before me in Jerusalem. Also my wisdom remained with me. Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had spent in doing it. And again, all was hevel and a chasing after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun. All right, so we'll stop there. We'll keep the other passages for a little bit later on. And I'm going to talk in a few minutes about some different backgrounds here. But I'll just take another minute for you to look over the passage, maybe just jot down some notes if you have any questions or things that this makes you think of. And then I would love to hear from you about that. So take a minute to just look over it for yourself. All right, so let's hear what stands out to you here in this Kohelet's search for pleasure, or questions that you have, or phrases you underlined. Ryan?
He was testing himself.
Mm-hmm.
It almost got sort of the converse of what Job went through.
Yeah.
Sort of experienced
That's really interesting.
all the
Yeah.
destruction, and he was testing himself as sort of the opposite.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Well, that passage you just read, it seems like it has to do with the acquisition of stuff, the taking in of stuff, but without any nourishment. Nothing spiritual, nothing emotional.
Right, and that seems to be sort of part of the emptiness of it. Although, as we'll see, some of the things that he's talking about, like wine, he does actually advocate, that as part of the good aspects of pleasure later. But I think you're right that that's part of the negative aspect of it here.
It's all about me.
yeah, that's true.
There's nothing about pleasure in generosity.
Yeah, it's very focused on him. Yeah, very true.
This isn't profound, but it's a little amusing. I enjoyed, what is lacking cannot be counted. That's like saying, if you're not here, raise your hand.
Yeah.
Is that Bob and I were in a group of people one time, not long ago, well, a couple years ago, and apparently I didn't get what was being discussed, or I said something sort of ignorant that showed I didn't know much about the subject, and Bob just looked at me with this little amused look on his face and said, if ignorance is bliss, why aren't you happier?
Ouch. Thank you. Yeah.
So this goes to increase knowledge, increase knowledge.
Yeah.
So I was noticing the author writes about his search here as kind of a search for wisdom, but I think we also take it as a search for happiness, for peace of mind, and so forth. And the other thought that brought to mind is kind of the reverse of that. Is reading this is kind of more understandable to me why other philosophers say that the Buddhist tradition have come up with the idea that the path to happiness is in giving up desire, not pursuing everything that you want.
Right. I think there's actually a lot of interesting sort of overlap with some of those ideas, and I don't think you really see that idea of renouncing desire in Ecclesiastes exactly, but there's a kind of pointing in that direction in a certain way. Yeah. Jonathan.
Something I noticed that I've never seen before is in 2, 5, and 6, there's this language that sounds kind of like the beginning of Genesis about like trees and watering, like growing. And then Brian's comment also made me think that the next verse 7, it kind of sounds like Job with all this like cattle and flocks and stuff. So I wonder, is there anything, and this is just a thought, I wouldn't pray answer necessarily, but is there kind of, is he almost picturing himself as God, kind of setting up this miniature creation or something that's the Job thing would be different. But
right. That's interesting. I never thought about it that way, but there do seem to be the kind of shadow of Genesis 3 and the situation of when Adam and Eve get kicked out of the garden. It does seem to loom large over Ecclesiastes, and there's all there's all this talk about death and people going to the dust, returning to the ground, which seems to echo that. But people do talk about kings setting up these parks and paradises and stuff that are like Eden-like places. So it does seem like maybe that's really interesting that he's maybe trying to recreate an Eden, a Garden of Eden, that's ultimately a failure. Bill?
So it's striking here, it's on the top of page 2, to see this phrase, how to lay hold on folly.
Yeah.
And then, until I might see what was good for mortals to do. And there seems that mortals to do piece seems to go back to verses 12 and maybe 13, where there's a focus on what is done. Human beings to be busy with, the deeds that are done. And we spend a lot of our lives doing. And perhaps part of his reference to laying a hold on folly is his recognition that in our zeal to do, sometimes we neglect to be.
Yeah, that's really interesting. There's so much emphasis on toil and work and doing that I think you're right on there. Yeah.
Piggybacking on that, I was
thinking as you were reading through it, I was getting more and more exhausted. Just hearing you go through this, and I thought, you know, when we're so tired, you lose perspective on what matters. And it's easier sometimes to just keep doing rather than to get off and get perspective.
Yeah. No, sure.
It just struck me in this passage here, there's only one personal pronoun, and it's the word I.
Yeah,
I.
yeah.
It's never you or we, so it's all very self-centered activity.
Yeah. Right. And when, you know, going forward, at least some of what he counsels in terms of pleasure involves a community, at least your family, and then elsewhere it talks about, you know, people supporting each other. A cord of 3 strands is not easily broken and stuff. So that perhaps that focus on I is what part of what makes this so such an empty or futile search for pleasure. Huh?
My reading of that was more that people understand and are happy to take the benefits of what he's doing, but don't really express any appreciation for having that. And that is what is missing.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I do want to talk about how this does call to mind Solomon, and in Solomon's time, and if you look at the King's account in 1 Kings, it is Solomon, because of his wisdom and the blessings that God has given to him, people are really at peace during his reign. There's lots of riches, and even, you know, there's a trickle down to the ordinary people who are for the most part doing well. Although there is this issue of forced labor that Solomon conscripts people in, and it doesn't last for long when Solomon's son Rehoboam comes to power. So he doesn't really reflect here explicitly on, you know, his subjects, but that may be in there from the allusions to the King's account. Yeah, interesting.
I'm just struck by it's like a sense, like a burden of searching for something, and then frustration and finding just sort of futility with that.
Yeah.
So it said that at the end it says, "For my heart found pleasure in all my toil," which sounds nice.
Right.
And this is my reward for all my toil. Then I considered all that my hands have done and the toil I had spent in doing it, and again, all was humble. So it feels rather hopeless.
And this kind of happens a lot in the book, this kind of whiplash between like, it sounds pretty good, my heart finds pleasure in my toil, this is my reward for my toil, I've worked hard, I deserve it, I deserve all this stuff, but actually, it's not that great. That's a good point. Any other comments or questions? So, I think everybody's right on here. I just wanted to talk about a couple of backgrounds here that we can, other lenses we can look at this text through the Bible, and also an other ancient Near Eastern genre of royal inscriptions or royal annals. So as I said, of course, the kind of Solomon persona is strongest in this passage, and the king's references I put there on the biblical background are part of the Solomon story that we see at the beginning of 1 Kings. I didn't put the text actually there, so you'll have to look it up for yourself if you want. But there's definitely strong reminiscences of that story. So in 1 Kings 3, God appears to Solomon in a dream and says, "Ask for whatever you want." And Solomon asks for wisdom. And so God says, "Since you ask for wisdom and not riches or glory, I am going to give you wisdom, but I'm also going to give you riches and glory and a long life if you obey me." And so Solomon is this quintessential wise king, and the whole Solomon account, or much of it, and especially we see it in chapter 3 and 4, Solomon is displaying his wisdom in all these different ways. There's the famous story of him, the women who come and they're arguing over the baby, and he says to chop it in half, and that he finds the true mother that way. It also says Solomon was in 1 Kings 4 that he was wiser than everybody in the East. So the East kind of in the Bible is known for people who are wise, and that he composed proverbs, he composed songs, and he also discoursed about like trees and plants. So even like science, Solomon was an expert in. And so he has and then he has this great wisdom in terms of administration and things like that. There's some verbal echoes as well. So in the Ecclesiastes account, when he says towards the beginning, I said to my heart, I have acquired great wisdom. In Hebrew, it's I have grown great and increased in wisdom. And those phrases really echo the other Kings passages I have on here. In 10:7, the Queen of Sheba who comes to visit Solomon says, you have increased wisdom and prosperity. And at the end of chapter 10, in verse 23, it says, King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in wealth and wisdom. The word is the same, to become greater, as it is in that phrase. I said to my heart, I've grown great and increased in wisdom. I've acquired great wisdom. So there seems to be deliberate echoes of that Solomon account. There might also be, as I said, a little bit of a shadow of what happened to Solomon eventually. So Solomon gets these, he has 700 wives, 300 concubines. It says that they led his heart astray and he started worshiping other gods. And he also had this situation of forced labor to do some of the work in the kingdom. And after he died, his son Rehoboam was not as wise as him, and he listened to his young counselors instead of the older, wiser counselors. And the young counselors said to make the people's work even harder. So the people had said, "Hey, we're doing too much work for you." The young counselors said, "Give them even more work." And then that led to 10 tribes breaking away under Jeroboam, and that's the split of the division of the kingdom. And so the northern kingdom split off from the kingdom of Judah, and the kingdom never was reunited, even though there's kind of this hope or ideal for a reunited Israel. So I don't know if that's explicitly, in the background here. It's not really reflected on, but if we are supposed to think of the kind of whole history of Israel behind this. And there are other clues later in the text that hint to other times in Israel's history. There's a little vignette in chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes that talks about a poor but wise youth and a foolish king. And it says the poor one comes out of prison to reign even though he was born poor, and all the people followed this young wise youth. But then the people who came later just forgot about him. And so anyway, there's this little image of this poor but wise youth who becomes king and deposes maybe this wise king. Might have echoes of some other times in Israel's history, like David replacing King Saul, or Jeroboam, like I said, in just the situation, Jeroboam breaking away from Rehoboam, or Jeroboam following Solomon, the wise king, or even Absalom's revolt against his father David later. So later in the book, too, we can see probably some other echoes of just these various times in Israel's history. But, of course, the main one, especially here that we're thinking about, is Solomon, because he is this quintessential wise king, but who also kind of gets caught up in folly in his life, especially through his wives. But another genre that seems to be probably in the background here, that many people see in the background, are various kinds of royal inscriptions that we see all throughout the ancient Near Eastern world, Mesopotamia. There's lots and lots of examples of this. I put just 2 examples here, especially before we get to Gilgamesh. And so one is the Annals of Mesha, and one is the Annals of Sennacherib. These are on the 3rd page of the handout. Like I said, there's lots of examples of this, so I just chose a couple. But kings, of course, in the ancient world, they like to brag about all the things that they had done. And a lot of times they put this up on, a big stone they inscribed it in, or some kind of other clay tablet they recorded these things on. The Mesha Annals is on a big stone, stela. It's in the Louvre, I think. And it's from the 9th century, so the Moabites were people who lived across the Jordan River from Israel. This particular text is important for biblical studies in general because, and the part that I didn't put on here, Mesha is talking about how King Omri of Israel had taken some of his territory, and then he got these cities back from Omri's son. Maybe his grandson Joram. Anyway, the events are similar to what we see in 2 Kings 3, so that's another story. For our purposes, I want to talk more about this genre. So you can see what Mesha is doing here. He says, I'm Mesha from Dion, ruler of Moab. My father, Kemoshgut, ruled Moab for 30 years, and then I became king. I built this sanctuary for my divine patron Chemosh, that's their main god, because he gave me victories over my enemies. I built Carpe with gates and towers, a palace and reservoirs. I also decreed every household in Carpe is to have its own cistern. I had my prisoners of war from Israel dig the cisterns of Carpe. I built Aroer and a road up from the Arnon Valley. I also rebuilt the cities of Beit Bamoth and Bezer. I reigned in peace over hundreds of villages which I had conquered. So you can see kind of some similarities, I think, here. It begins, I am Mesha, just like I, Kohelet, I, the teacher, was king over Israel. And then all these projects that he did, building projects and water works kind of projects and palaces and these reservoirs and this kind of bragging about what he did. It's not exactly the same because it's a little more focused on king type activities and these villages and subjects. Not so personal, even though it does say I. Also, the Annals of Sennacherib, this is another one I put on here. This is from Assyria in the 7th century. This is also one important one for biblical studies. It's written on these, there's I think 3 copies of it on these clay prisms that are like hexagons, written in Akkadian script. And in part of this text, Sennacherib talks about his campaign against Judah and how he trapped Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. And it's a very interesting perspective when you read it alongside of the story as it is in 2 Kings or Isaiah, also another story. But also kind of similar to this genre of what we have in Ecclesiastes. So Sennacherib, the great king, the mighty king, king of the universe, king of Assyria, king of the 4 quarters, the wise ruler, favorite of the great gods. He talks about this campaign against the king of Babylon. He says, I opened his treasure house, gold, silver, vessels of gold and silver, precious stones of every kind, goods and property without limit, heavy tribute, his harem, courtiers and officials, singers, male and female, all his artisans. Again, the Kohelet mentions male and female singers specifically. At this time, I, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, first among the princes, with waters from the canals which I had caused to be dug, supplied Nineveh, together with its neighborhood. Gardens, vineyards, all kinds of products of all the mountains, the fruits of all lands I planted, setting free the waters where they did not reach the thirsty field, and reviving its vegetation. So again, bragging about all the things he's done, all the stuff he has, the building projects, there's the waters and the, gardens and vineyards, the male and female singers, is a similar thing. And there's lots and lots of examples of these, some that I didn't put on here. In some of them, the kings boast about their wisdom, so that would be another similarity. And it's also a very common motif to say that I was better than everyone who reigned before me in this place. That's really similar. That's the same thing as what Kohelet says. I acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. If you're reading this if you're thinking only of Solomon, it's not much of a boast because only David reigned before him in Jerusalem. So some people are kind of troubled by that. Like, how can he say he was, surpassed all who were before him in Jerusalem when it's only David? Is he talking about pre-Israelite kings who reigned in Jerusalem or something? But this seems to be just more of a convention of the genre. That's something the king said, is that they were better than everybody who ruled before them. And so it seems like what Kohelet is doing here in this passage is really subverting this kind of royal genre, this kind of royal inscription, where the kings are boasting in all their accomplishments, and they want everybody to see and they want everybody to remember all their accomplishments. And Kohelet has a very similar kind of account to these kings, but in the end, it's just hevel. It's chasing after wind, and it's not really worthwhile. So he's really kind of turning that genre on its head. And using it to kind of exploit this idea of even if you're great, powerful, wise, rich, in the end, it's still vanity, it's still futile, and ultimately maybe not worthwhile. And he goes on in this passage to talk about death. That's kind of at the center of the passage. And we're not focusing on that today, but that's a big issue for him, is that you can do all this great stuff and then you still die. And that's a real focus of...
In the long run, we're all dead.
Happy Mother's Day. And that's really the same message, very similar message of the Gilgamesh epic. That's the last passage I have on there. I talked about this a little bit last time. And this story is very ancient, from Sumerian times in the 3rd millennium, and then it goes through lots of different editions. There's a Babylonian edition, and then there's a well-known Assyrian one from the 7th century. I believe that the Assyrian one is the one that has this first part about Gilgamesh bragging about his accomplishments on a stela. So Gilgamesh is also a king. Gilgamesh is a king, so he's powerful, he has lots of resources, he's also portrayed as wise. And he, at the beginning of this, in the Assyrian version, he says, I built the massive walls surrounding Uruk. I built Eanna, a flawless sanctuary for Anu and Ishta. Admire the copper molding running below its ceilings. Contemplate its unique interior walls. No ruler can claim such monuments. No human can ever equal my achievements. So Gilgamesh, just like all these other kings, is bragging about all that stuff. But as the epic goes on, the message is a lot similar, very similar to what we see in Ecclesiastes. So Gilgamesh learns, for example, this quote here: "Only the gods live forever with the sun. As for human beings, their days are numbered. Whatever they achieve is but wind." That you can see really close similarities with Ecclesiastes. This imagery of the wind, even the sun. Kohelet's always talking about life under the sun. So only the gods are the ones who live not under the sun. They live forever. And humans, their lives are fleeting. And that's what Gilgamesh, after the death of his friend in the Gilgamesh epic, is really wrestling with, this problem of mortality. And then this passage I mentioned last time, Gilgamesh comes to this tavern keeper, this beer brewer, a woman, and she gives him this advice. As for you, Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, enjoy yourself day and night, find enjoyment every day, dance and play day and night. Let your garments be clean, let your head be washed, bathe in water. Look upon the little one who holds your hand, let your spouse enjoy herself in your embrace. It's a little spicier than Ecclesiastes, but basically the same elements that we'll see mostly in the next passages I have. But before we go on to that potential of pleasure, any comments or questions on these background texts? Yeah.
So would the author of this book have known the sentence in the middle of the passage that you're citing from
Gilgamesh?
Because it seems so close.
Right. So copies of Gilgamesh have been found in Israel region. I don't know the details on that, and it was something that was around for so long in various forms that I think for Gilgamesh at least, it's reasonable to think that the author, especially in this later time period, was familiar with it. Either, I don't know if he encountered it as a written text or orally, but it's a text that had wide influence and has been found in that area, so it's reasonable to think that probably yes. I don't know which, in terms of the royal inscriptions and annals and stuff, I don't know, I wouldn't say necessarily that he knew about the Mesha stele or the annals of Sennacherib or something, but if this was a genre that is it is a genre that's widespread, so I don't know exactly which texts of those he would have been familiar with, but it seems likely that he could have been familiar with that royal things as a genre, royal inscriptions as a general genre, but I don't know which actual instances of it. Jonathan?
As I think about those royal inscriptions, some of them, the kings will boast that part of the reason they're so great and they did stuff that their predecessors didn't is that they created social equilibrium and they raised up certain social classes. And I think their point is propagandistic. They're saying, oh, my constituents, look how great I make things for you. But I wonder, that's interesting, and I wonder what Ecclesiastes the author would say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is doing social good, even if it's in your own self-interest, is that something to criticize, or is that just something different? Because it does seem focused on, like you're saying at the beginning, me.
Right. I noticed that in the Sennacherib one at the beginning, it's a part that I cut out, but he goes on to say, like, yes, I'm a ruler of justice, and I bring justice to the poor, and stuff like that. And I left it out because it doesn't really seem to be drawn on, at least in this passage in Ecclesiastes, which is interesting. I mean, Kohelet does wrestle with the idea of injustice, and he talks about in the book, there's a part that says, I looked and I saw it in the place of justice, there was injustice, and I can't remember the exact wording, but and it also talks about the oppressed. I looked and I saw the oppressed, and the tears of the oppressed, and their power was on the side of the oppressors, and there was nobody to help them. So he's disturbed by the issue of injustice. He's not, as the book goes on, it's not only about him and his own personal search for wisdom and pleasure. He is disturbed by injustice. So I would think that he sees justice, including maybe justice given by kings, as a positive thing, but maybe that he doesn't actually, the problem is he doesn't see it playing out. So yeah, that's interesting. And he doesn't really reflect on that as a solution as much as he reflects on taking joy in daily pleasures. He doesn't say like, and you could find meaning by, promoting justice, even though he is disturbed by injustice.
Yeah. The other thing I was thinking of in hearing the second of these is, not only can all this searching after power and goods and everything like that feel unsatisfying, but it can also be taken away from you. So I was just remembering the Lord Byron poem, The Destruction of Snacker.
Yeah, can you say, I'm not familiar with it?
I think the first line is that the Syrian came down like a wolf on the fold.
Oh yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's great. I'll check it out. I'm gonna write it down. Other comments? Let's look at these passages under the potential of pleasure. So that's the third thing we're going to look at. There's these passages that people sometimes call the Carpe Diem passages in Ecclesiastes. There's a number of them. I just put two on the handout here from Ecclesiastes 5 and Ecclesiastes 9. These are good representatives, but you see this message a couple other times in the book, including in chapter 2 towards the end. I didn't put that one on there, but this in the same kind of Solomon-like persona, he does advise this. So this is what he says in chapter 5. This is what I've seen to be good. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in all the toil with which one toils under the sun, the few days of the life God gives us, for this is our lot. Likewise, to all whom God gives wealth and possessions, and whom he enables to enjoy them, and to accept their lot and find enjoyment in their toil, this is the gift of God. For they will scarcely brood over the days of their lives, because God keeps them occupied with the joy of their hearts. There's an interesting connection some people draw with some Egyptian text. So in Egyptian, the phrase in Egyptian for entertainment is diverting the heart, which I think we kind of understand that metaphor today too. There's these harpers' songs, various Egyptian songs that were written on inscriptions and I think sometimes said at funerals. One of the harpers' songs says, "Hence rejoice in your heart, forgetfulness profits you, follow your heart as long as you live." So this idea of following your heart, which also is a phrase that's in Ecclesiastes, and that kind of pleasure can distract you from the difficulties of life. And then we'll do Ecclesiastes 9, and then we'll just talk about these all together. So it says, "Go, eat your bread with enjoyment, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved what you do. Let your garments always be white, do not let oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your hevel life that are given you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do with your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going." That's the passage that's really close. Yeah, another downer. That's another passage that's really close to that's the one that's really close to the Gilgamesh one. So it has really the same items too. Let your belly be full. So it has eat your bread with enjoyment. And let your garments be clean. Similar, let your garments be white. Let your head be washed. Kohel, it says, let oil not be lacking on your head. And then it mentions the wife. I like the Gilgamesh one, mentions the child. Look upon the little one who holds your hand, which is mentioned in Ecclesiastes, but that's a good one for Mother's Day. But, pretty much the same items, and really the message in Gilgamesh is the same too. You should enjoy those because life is fleeting. And this, if you're not familiar with this concept of Sheol, many of you are, I'm sure, in the Old Testament, it's basically the grave, the underworld, and it's, in King James, sometimes it's translated as hell, but it's not really hell. Everybody goes there to Sheol, basically, in the Old Testament. But it's not really a problem for people who live out a long life. So people, the Old Testament, for the most part, is focused on life and a kind of here and now life. And so when people live out to their life to an old age and they see their children's children and they die, the Old Testament doesn't say and they died and they went to Sheol and it was gloomy down there or something like that. It just, they died, old and full of years, and kind of case closed, and it's good. Sheol is a problem for most of the Old Testament when people die young, or they're sick, or wicked people go to Sheol prematurely because they're wicked. So they get in, their kind of punishment is to die before their time. That's kind of the problem of Sheol for most of the Old Testament, I would say. But in Ecclesiastes, he seems to be struggling just in general with this idea of everybody dying. And of course, in a Christian context, or even a Jewish context today, we have different conceptions of afterlife and resurrection, and that's true in Judaism as well. So it's, here is an example, I think, where we have somewhat of a different perspective from the one Kohelet has, and I sometimes wrestle with what that message is to us. But let's just kind of zoom out again, and I want to think about these two pictures of pleasure that we've seen. So one is this kind of, the search that we saw in chapter 1 and 2 that ends up just being hevel and chasing after wind, and nothing is to be gained. And then, on the other hand, these admonitions to pleasure that we find throughout the book, including the ones I have here in Ecclesiastes 5 and 9. What do we do with these two? Are these talking about different kinds of pleasure, do you think? Is there some kind of different perspective here? How do you kind of find your way through the tension here? Ryan?
I just noticed, I was thinking about who's talking here. It's hard not to read this, well, this is somebody reflecting from a position of having things.
Yeah, that's true.
This person has wealth. They have things. So in some ways, I think it's a very limited worldview. And so maybe what you were saying earlier, if we're getting past where there's problems with that justice that we eventually get to. I'm struck with how limited this person's advantage is.
Right.
Because they can't get outside the advantage of well, obviously we all have wine, obviously we all have wealth, and innumerable things to enjoy. Go enjoy them. I'm stuck there. I think that's some of the tension.
Yeah, it is a privileged position, and I think actually speaks to many of us who are in a position to be able to enjoy these basic pleasures of life, which not everybody is in a position to do. Right?
Yeah, you're asking, the question is contrasting 9 and 1, the two different passages. I agree with you, Ryan, about the perspective in 9. I do think, though, there's probably more moderation in 9. I mean, there's not this sort of insatiable desire to consume and to build and to create that you see in the second half of the passage in chapter 1 that you mentioned. So I do see a little bit more restraint. There certainly is. It is still coming from a place of privilege. But, I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. These are more. It is true that not everybody has access to these, but it's a different picture from like palaces and singers and slaves and stuff that you see in the first part. Bill and then Jack.
Well, yeah, I mean, accepting both of those comments, I think it's important to recognize that the very next verse is, so it's verse 11 in chapter 9, is, again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. So, while it does come from a position of wealth and privilege, there's also a recognition that the king or the teacher, the people with privilege, are also, just like those without privilege, held in the hollow of God's hand. So there seems a humility that immediately follows this statement of privilege. And I think that's what it means.
Yeah, and that is a big message of the book, that, especially because of death and the uncertainty of how life is going to play out, ultimately the rich or the powerful are not ultimately any better off than the poor. So that's a great point. Thank you.
I can't help but, as a Christian, look at this book through the prism of the sisters of Lazarus. And I mean, maybe I'm just way off base here, but the Mary Martha duality strikes me as close to what Kohelet is teaching.
Yeah, that's really
Is
interesting.
there anything to that?
I've never thought about that way, but I think that's really interesting. Can you say more about where you see the Mary and the Martha in?
So, death has a way of, closeness to death and to dying has a way of offering us a lens on living. And these two sisters had a uniquely powerful opportunity to contemplate both death and life. And they also had this very close relationship with Jesus as teacher and responded in quite different ways. And perhaps part of what we are seeing through Kohelet is a door into the fact that we are both doers and beings, and that the life we lead is one in which we aren't only people of hands, but also of heart and head, and that he's calling us into a fullness of flourishing, which is beyond what we might consider at first. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, do you see in these passages where it says kind of eat and drink and find enjoyment in your toil, is that pushing us toward that being, or is that still in the doing realm?
I think there's a recognition that that is a part of flourishing, but that there is much more, and that we may glimpse in the fleeting joy, in the fleeting pleasure, we may glimpse a deeper joy, which we may not know fully in this life, but through recognizing that we see, through, among other lenses, the lens of death, we see glimpses of something more. Maybe I'm way off.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. I'm just not sure how far Kohelet himself gets there. So, and one of my questions here is, does Kohelet recognize a possibility for something beyond just kind of pleasures? He does, and does he realize a kind of true joy? So he does use the word joy, like in chapter 5. God keeps them occupied with the joy of their hearts. So on the one hand, it seems like maybe he does realize a potential for kind of true happiness or joy beyond these just kind of surface pleasures. On the other hand, he doesn't reflect a lot on that idea of kind of or merely at all of kind of some kind of ultimate joy or rejoicing in God that you see in other parts of the Bible. And he doesn't seem to see anything going on beyond death. Although he does seem to believe in God's ultimate justice, and the frustration there is that he doesn't see it in the world. But he doesn't come out and say, like, God's going to bring everything to justice in the final judgment or something like that. Or that, like, there's something even greater awaiting. I don't think he really comes out and says that. Maybe there are hints towards that.
He tells it slant.
Yeah, that's true. Sorry, Jack, and then...
All right, just to follow up on a comment I think that Ryan made about the limited perspective here. I think it's also the case that Kohelet shows a very successful man who's at the top of his game, so to speak, and that there's no struggle here with issues of health or blood pressure. He doesn't need any hip replacements. He's not facing Alzheimer's disease or dementia. Seems to go to the jet industry. So
well, he does focus on death a lot.
Well, that's true. And yet, at the other hand, I think he sees that death is the great governor. Whether you're Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or some poor wretch in the ditch here, you're going to die. So I think in terms of our American death-denying culture, it's a good reminder that
Yeah.
you know we're not going to always be the way it is now.
Yeah. Yeah.
What I was thinking in listening to these excerpts from 5 and 9 is that you could look at them in two ways. I'm not sure if the structure of the book as a whole answers this. On the one hand, these could be taken as sort of the other side of the coin to, all these statements about how everything's fleeting and meaningless. It just sort of leaves it open for the reader to think about. Or this could be thought of as a potential resolution, in other words, saying, yes, everything's fleeting, but we can't change that. So
Right.
why shouldn't we enjoy life, that we've been given?
Right, and yeah, I think it is more of that. And one element you do see in chapter 5 and also chapter 9 that you don't see in chapter 1 for the most part is the idea that God enables people to have these gifts, that these are gifts from God, even though he doesn't see them as entirely unproblematic, but the idea that you could enjoy your toil and enjoy your day-to-day life is a gift from God, which is not quite a dimension that we see in the first couple chapters too much. Yeah, it looks like it's about time to pick kids up and wrap up, but yeah, Jan.
I have two thoughts.
Yeah.
One, as I listen to all of this, I sense our own culture, and that is this desire for balance. That something's out of whack.
Yeah.
And the need for balance. The other thing was just an odd thought. When you read the part about we're all going to hell.
I not hell, but Sheol.
I thought about, I think it was Winston Churchill, says if you're going through hell, keep going.
That's a good word. I do think he is struggling with this issue of balance, and we do see these kind of excesses in chapter 2 that I read, and I think there is a little more of a balance or an attempt at balance in the chapter 5 and the chapter 9 about enjoying everyday pleasures. These really ring true to me, even though I think they're not without their problems for Kohelet or us. But the idea of enjoying everyday pleasures, and I'm a kind of person who, like I'm sure many of you, like to cross things off my to-do list and keep thinking, like, once I get over this next hump, then I'll relax, then things will be good. And then, of course, there's always the next thing once you get over the one. But I do think this idea of admonition towards daily pleasures is something that's really valuable. And in some other parts of the Bible, it's not focused on as much. There are other places that you find it in the Bible. But just this idea that God has given us these gifts and God can enable us to enjoy them. Even though, like I said, Kohelet doesn't quite rest totally content in this picture. I do think it is one way forward in our transient lives and messy lives. So, any final comments or questions as we go out? All right. Well, I think we'll probably take a look at time next time, and that we're coming up to the chapter 3 with the famous time poem. So, I hope I see you next week, and feel free to email me in the meantime if you have any comments that come up. So, thank you, everybody.